In today's episode, a young couple soon to be married goes on a camping trip with friends. During that trip, the group breaks one of the most important safety rules when camping. Don't leave food around the tents at night. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying bear attack on John Richardson and Linda Moore. Welcome to Final Affliction. John Richardson and Linda Moore had been dating for the past 4 years. They had gotten married the moment they met. Both Linda and John knew after the very first date that they were meant to be together and knew they would be together forever. But Linda was studying at UCLA, a big deal for a woman in 1971, and she was determined to get her doctoral degree before she took any time off for wedding planning, honeymoons, and all of that. John didn't mind, though. He'd waited his 31 years on this earth for a woman like Linda, so what was a few more years anyway? She was his, and he was hers. A court document with their names on it didn't change that fact in the slightest. Besides, it was Linda's brains and her ambition that made him fall in love with her. The 70s wasn't exactly a progressive time, so the two couldn't live together without being married, or both their very religious families would be mortified at their indiscretions. So they settled for taking as many weekends away together as they could, mostly going camping, since they enjoyed the great outdoors a lot. Getting away from the busy life of university with a short trip to nature was always something they looked forward to each week. They always took a friend or two, sometimes one of their parents, but most of the time they took John's half-brother, George Waddell, his wife, and their 3 kids. John liked to teach his godchildren to fish, and Linda ran and played with them in the streams. George and his wife didn't mind the attention at all. The young couple obviously enjoyed the children, and he and his wife could finally take a breather between child-rearing and work schedules. On the weekend of July the 26th, the group of them headed off toward Grand Lake, Colorado, looking forward to 4 days of fun and nature at Holsworth Ranch, just a little ways away from the Rocky National Park. Linda and John only had a single-man tent each, so they set them up next to each other, and George had bought his camper van to accommodate his family of 5. In 2 weeks' time, Linda and John would be married, and they wouldn't have to sleep separately anymore, something that they were both looking forward to. They set up camp while Linda took the kids to explore, and when they got back to the tents, they were erected and the fishing poles were already out. George's oldest son, 10-year-old George Jr., was the lucky one that day. The boy caught enough fish for the entire family, so they fried them up in a pan over the open fire for dinner. The cooler with chops and hot dogs stood forgotten in the camper, with so much fresh fish right there in front of them. The children began to doze off next to the fireside as the grown-ups had a drink or two and chatted into the evening. When the littlest one began to snore, the adults bid everyone good night. Tomorrow was going to be a long day of hiking and more exploring. Everyone needed to have enough sleep for it. John kissed Linda goodnight, and they each retreated to their own tents while the Waddell family settled in their camper. But they'd left all of their plates, the pan, and the potato chip bag where they'd sat down for dinner, with plans to clean up the next morning before breakfast. And you probably know where this is going by now. All that food and the strong smell of cooked fish wafted into the forest, attracting every critter in the vicinity. Soon, a few field mice and even a raccoon got a taste of the scraps. As the night wore on and the little critters had their fill, another, bigger omnivore was making its way toward the scent. It took the 200-pound black bear all night to trek through the brush and to reach the camp just as the sun broke over the horizon. Everyone was still fast asleep, except for John. He sleepily stumbled out of his tent with the intention of emptying his bladder behind a crop of trees before heading back to bed to catch some more sleep. He walked down the very path that the hairy creature was approaching from, just 8 yards away from his tent flap. It's hard to say who was the most shocked. John, in his half-asleep state walking into a colossal, fully grown bear, or the animal who wasn't expecting to run into a human. But the reaction from both was instantaneous. The animal roared with shock and anger, pulling itself up to its hind legs, extending its full height. John turned and ran, but with his pants half undone, he barely made it a yard before his loose clothes tangled around his legs and he went sprawling into the forest floor. Before John had the chance to yell out to his fiancée and his friends, the animal was already on top of his back, clamping its teeth into the back of his head, neck, and back. Linda, who was closest to the scene, woke up in a panic and headed out before she even understood what she was hearing. To her horror, she stumbled into the worst event she'd ever witnessed in her life. John was in the bear's mouth, being lifted into the air by the back of his shirt, and blood was spewing everywhere, turning the animal's fur dark red. The fabric of his shirt ripped clean out of the bear's teeth, and he fell to the ground. Linda launched herself at them, screaming a primal cry as she went. She threw herself over the fiancé's lifeless body, shielding him from the raging bear. The beast grabbed her by the back, using both its teeth and its claws. They went through her nightshirt like they weren't even there, raking grooves an inch deep into her skin as they went. It lifted her off John and threw her aside to get back at its initial target. Linda was thrown several feet away, landing hard against the trunk of a tree, breaking 3 of her ribs. She was knocked out cold from the strike against the tree that expelled all of the air in her lungs. Suddenly, George came running at them, dressed only in his sleeping shorts. Like Linda, he hadn't stopped to consider the danger to himself. He spared only a second to yell for his wife to lock the door and arm herself before he set off to do what he had to do to save his baby brother and future sister-in-law. As he came at the bear, he passed the fireplace and grabbed the pan they'd left there the night before. Bits of fish and cold, clumpy oil flew through the air when he brandished it. The bear charged at George, swinging wildly. The pan clanged against the animal's paw just as it swiped at George, undoubtedly saving George's face from a severe mauling. The bear barely felt the pan strike it, but it did feel the fish bones and oil that went into its eyes. Clawing at its own face to get the fine shards of bone out of its eyes, it began to yowl in pain and run back into the forest from where it came. It passed Linda on its way out, where she was playing dead next to the tree. George headed toward John, while his wife, who'd locked their children in the camper van, went off to help Linda. Linda groaned in pain. The wounds on her back were seeping blood, but no longer flowing freely. She was alive, despite her broken ribs and the damage to her back. But John was another story altogether. Lying on his stomach, he wasn't moving, and George could see the horrendous damage done to the back of his neck even before he reached his brother. The back of John's neck had been torn out almost completely. His vertebrae were poking through the shreds of flesh, and George could see blood pouring out in tune with his heart. Within seconds of reaching his body, the blood torrent stopped. There was no more left to spill, and his heart stopped beating before George could even turn him over. He loaded his dead brother into the camper while his wife wrapped Linda's wounds as best she could. Together, they carried her inside, too. It took them 20 minutes to reach the ranch owner, where they called in for help. The children never moved from the bed where they were huddled together in fear. Their uncle and aunt were both torn and broken, in full view on the camper floor. There was no way to spare them from the sight, not if they were going to get Linda to help on time. Thankfully, Linda's injuries, as severe as they were not very deep. Doctors worried that there had been damage to her spine, but miraculously there was no lasting damage. Her broken ribs posed the biggest threat, given that they were practically shattered, and they feared that bone would find its way into her lungs. But even with that danger, Linda made a full recovery and was out of the hospital within the week. They held John's funeral on what would have been their 1-week wedding anniversary, with Linda still in a wheelchair next to his gravesite when they lowered him into the ground. Unfortunately, no one could locate the bear. Professional hunters and sniffer dogs spent 2 weeks scouring the area, but it was gone just as quickly as it had come. There were more attacks in the years after Richard's death, and not all of those bears were identified either. So it's possible his killer went on to bring even more unsuspecting campers to their terrifying final affliction.